She threw every letter he'd ever sent back into his face the moment she stepped off that stagecoach, every cold 4-word note he'd mailed to Ohio over 3 months. Not one of them containing a single human word of welcome. Not one of them giving her any reason to believe this journey wasn't the worst mistake of her life. And the entire town of Pine Creek, Montana went dead silent. Watching Margaret Ellis stand in the middle of that dirt road with mud on her boots and fury in her eyes, holding her own suitcase because he hadn't even bothered to reach for it. Staring up at the largest, coldest, most stone-faced man she had ever seen in her 28 years on this earth, and say in a voice that didn't shake even a little, "I didn't come 2,000 miles to be treated like a piece of livestock you're deciding whether to keep. So either shake my hand like I'm a human being, or point me toward the next stagecoach out. If you've ever felt invisible, if you've ever been told your worth was less than it truly was, stay with me through every part of this story, because what happens next on that mountain is going to remind you exactly what strength looks like when the world has done its very best to break it." Subscribe to this channel right now and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. And drop a comment below telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Pine Creek, Montana, and find out what happened when the woman everyone expected to fail became the only person strong enough to save them both. The stagecoach had been 6 days on the road from Cheyenne, and Margaret Ellis had spent most of those 6 days pressed against the window, watching the world change around her in ways that made her chest feel tight, in a way she couldn't fully name. She had left Ohio in the gray of early morning with 1 trunk, 1 hat box, 1 suitcase, and a letter folded so many times the creases had gone soft and pale. The letter was from the matrimonial agency, not from Colton Hayes himself. The agency had composed it on his behalf, they said. He was a busy man, a rancher, a widower, a serious man who needed a practical woman with strong character and no illusions about mountain life. She had read that letter 47 times. She had counted. She had not told her sister how many times she'd read it, because her sister would have wept and begged her not to go, and Margaret had already made her choice before the letter arrived in the first place. She had made her choice the morning she turned 28 and realized she had spent the last 10 years of her life waiting for a life that wasn't coming to her in Ohio, waiting in her mother's house, waiting through church socials where men looked past her, waiting through years of being told in ways both direct and agonizingly polite that a woman built the way she was built didn't have the same options as other women. She was not going to wait anymore, so she had written to the agency herself. She had filled out their forms in her clearest handwriting. She had listed her skills: cooking, mending, bookkeeping, animal care, hard work, and she had listed her honest measurements in the section marked physical description, because she was not going to begin a new life with a lie. She had folded the forms into an envelope, walked to the post office herself, and handed them across the counter with steady hands. 3 weeks later, the letter from the agency arrived. Colton Hayes of Pine Creek, Montana had selected her application. He had written, or rather, the agency had written on his behalf, 4 sentences. His ranch was 200 acres of mountain land. He required a capable woman who would not be deterred by difficult conditions. He was not a demonstrative man. He expected efficiency. That was everything. No warmth. No curiosity about her. No single question about who Margaret Ellis actually was. Her sister had read those 4 sentences and said very quietly, "Maggie, this man doesn't sound like he wants a wife. He sounds like he wants hired help." Margaret had looked at those 4 sentences for a long time. Then she had said, "Maybe. But he chose me out of however many applications they sent him, and I want to know why." She had packed her trunk the next morning. Now the stagecoach was rolling into Pine Creek, and Margaret was watching the town materialize through dusty glass, and what she felt was not the nervousness she had expected to feel. What she felt was something closer to clarity. She had made her choice. Whatever was coming, she was ready to meet it on its feet. She was not ready for what she saw when the stagecoach stopped, The town had turned out. That was the first thing she noticed. Not a few curious bystanders, the whole street was lined with people standing with their arms folded or their hands on their hips, watching the stagecoach door with the particular expression of people who had already decided what they were about to see. She recognized that expression. She had seen it her entire life. It was the expression of people who had already written the ending of the story before the story began. She recognized the man before the door even finished opening. He was standing 20 feet away, not in the crowd, but separate from it. And he was exactly as unmistakable as the rumors had described him. Tall, broad across the shoulders, with the kind of weathered stillness that comes from years of hard mountain work. He was wearing a dark coat and a hat pulled low, and his arms were crossed over his chest, and he was watching the stagecoach door with an expression that contained not one degree of welcome. Margaret stepped down from the coach. She heard it immediately, the sound that was not quite laughter but was close to it, the intake of breath, the murmur, the shift of the crowd as they got their first real look at her. She had heard that sound before too. She knew exactly what it meant. She picked up her suitcase before the driver could reach for it. She squared her shoulders. She walked toward Colton Hayes across the 20 feet of dirt between them, and she held his gaze the entire way, and she watched his face very carefully for what it would do when she got close enough for him to see her clearly. His face did nothing. Not cruelty, not contempt, not the flinch she had learned to brace for. Just nothing. A blankness so complete it was almost more unnerving than any reaction she had anticipated. He had sent her letters through the agency. 3 months of correspondence, all of it composed by the agency on his behalf. 4 words here, 6 words there. His ranch needed this. His schedule required that. Not one personal word in any of it. And now he was standing in front of her in the flesh, and his face still had nothing in it. He reached out one hand. Margaret thought he was reaching for her suitcase. Then she realized he was holding out a small bundle of envelopes. The letters. Every agency letter he had ever sent. She looked down at them. She looked back up at him. And something shifted in her, not quite anger, not quite hurt, but something that had been building across 6 days of stagecoach travel and 3 months of 4-word letters and a lifetime of being told she was less than she was, and it came up through her chest and out of her mouth before she made any decision to let it. She took the letters. She looked at him for 3 full seconds. Then she turned them over in her hands and dropped them back into his chest, one by one, deliberate and quiet. Not in rage, but in something far more controlled than rage. "I read every one of these," she said, and her voice was absolutely steady. "And not one of them told me a single thing about who you are. So I'll ask you directly, since we're standing here in person." She met his eyes and didn't look away. "Do you intend to treat me like a human being? Because if you don't tell me now, and I will find my own way forward from here. I did not travel 2,000 miles to be a piece of inventory on your list." The crowd had gone utterly silent. She heard someone cough. She heard a woman somewhere to her left exhale sharply. She did not look away from Colton Hayes. For a moment, just a moment, something moved in his eyes. There and gone so fast, she might have imagined it. Then the blankness returned, and he bent down and picked up the letters from where they'd fallen at his boots. And he straightened, and he looked at her with that same unreadable face, and he said, "Ranch is 2 hours away, wagons behind the livery." He picked up her trunk. He turned and walked. Margaret stood in the middle of the street with her suitcase in her hand and the entire town of Pine Creek watching her, and she had exactly 3 seconds to make the choice that would determine everything that came after. She picked up her suitcase and followed him. Behind her she heard the crowd begin to talk again. She caught fragments. A woman's voice saying she wouldn't last a week. A man's low comment about all the others who'd tried. A ripple of something that might have been pity and might have been amusement, and she couldn't entirely tell which was worse. She didn't stop walking. The wagon was an old one, solid and worn in the way that well-made things go when they've been properly used. He had already loaded her trunk by the time she reached it, and he was up on the seat holding the reins, not looking at her. She put her suitcase in the bed herself and climbed up to the seat without waiting for help, and when she settled beside him, He clicked his tongue at the horses, and they started moving, and that was it. That was the whole of their meeting. For the first half hour of the ride, neither of them spoke. Margaret watched the land change around her as they climbed. The town fell away behind them, and the road narrowed, and the trees thickened on both sides, and the air changed cleaner, colder, carrying something pine-sharp that she had never smelled anywhere in Ohio. It was beautiful in a way that she felt in her chest, instead of just her eyes. It was also enormous in a way that made Ohio feel like a small, close room she hadn't realized she'd been in for 28 years. She broke the silence first. Not because she was uncomfortable with it, but because she had questions, and she had come too far to sit on them. "How many women before me?" she asked. His jaw shifted. "6," he said. He said it without inflection, the same way he'd said ranch is 2 hours away. Like it was inventory. Like it was weather. "6," she repeated. She let that sit for a moment. "How long did the longest one stay?" Another pause. 9 days. "And the shortest?" 3. She nodded, looking at the road ahead. "What made them leave?" He didn't answer that one, not right away. She watched his hands on the reins, large hands heavily calloused, absolutely still, and she waited. And after a long moment he said, "They said it was the mountain." Was it the mountain? His jaw shifted again. That's what they said. She turned that over in her mind. Something told her that the 6 women who had come before her and left had told him whatever felt easiest to say. That the mountain is too hard was simpler than you are too hard. That it was gentler to blame the altitude than the silence. She decided not to say that. Not yet. She had only known this man for 2 hours, and they had spoken fewer than 30 words between them. She filed it away instead. "I'm not leaving," she said. He looked at her then. Directly for the first time since the street in Pine Creek. The horses kept their pace on their own, and he looked at her with that flat, unreadable face, and she looked back at him without flinching. "You say that now," he said. "I'll say it on the 9th day, too," she said. "And on the 10th. He looked back at the road. She faced forward and breathed in that cold pine air and told herself she had not just made a foolish promise. She told herself she believed it, and mostly in that moment she did. The ranch came into view at the top of a long switchback road, and her first impression was not of beauty or bleakness, but of scale. It was enormous. The main house was 2 stories of rough-hewn timber, the kind of house built to last, built by hands that understood permanence. There were outbuildings, a barn, a bunkhouse, a structure she didn't immediately recognize, and beyond them the land opened wide and steep and went up into mountain that disappeared into sky. It was the kind of place that could swallow a person whole if they let it. She did not let herself think about being swallowed. He showed her the house, in the same way he had spoken in the wagon, efficiently, without ornament. The kitchen. The parlor. The room that would be hers, plain and clean and cold, in the way that rooms get when no one has used them. He gave her a list. It was an actual physical list, written in a hand that was surprisingly careful, almost precise. Ranch duties, daily schedule, rules, 14 items. She read it while he watched her. "All right," she said when she finished. He blinked, just slightly. She thought she saw surprise move across his face before he controlled it. "All right," he repeated. "I can do all of these things," she said. "Some of them I'm better at than others, so if there's one you feel particularly strongly about, tell me now, and I'll start there." She folded the list and put it in her apron pocket. "Is there anything I should know about the kitchen before I start supper?" He stood looking at her for a moment with that expression she was beginning to understand was not coldness, but something more like watchfulness. Like a man waiting for the trick. "Stove runs hot on the left side," he said finally. "Thank you," she said. She went to the kitchen. She heard him stand in the doorway for a moment, not speaking, not moving. Then she heard his boots on the floor as he walked away out the back door. And she was alone in someone else's kitchen in Montana, and she allowed herself privately one single moment of terror before she put it away and started looking for the flour. The first supper she made was simple. She didn't know what he liked. She didn't know what he had. She worked with what was in the larder beans, salt pork cornbread from a sack of meal she found in the back cupboard, and she set it on the table at what seemed like a reasonable hour for supper, and she sat down and waited. He came in from outside, hung his coat, washed his hands at the basin. He sat down across from her. He looked at the food. He looked at her. He picked up his fork. They ate in silence. She didn't try to fill it. She had decided on the wagon ride up that she was not going to chase his conversation or perform cheerfulness to make him more comfortable. She was going to be exactly who she was, and she was going to see who that made him into. He ate everything on his plate. He put down his fork. He stood up. "Good," he said, and walked out. She sat alone at the table in the lamplight and told herself that good from a man like that was probably the loudest compliment she was going to get for a very long time. She was right. The first week was the hardest thing she had ever done, and she had done hard things. She woke before dawn because the list said to. She went to bed after dark because there was always something left. She learned the stove and its bad side. She learned where the hens preferred to lay and where they didn't. She learned that two of the ranch hands, a young man named Billy and an older one named Chet, would nod to her when they passed and were generally decent, and that the rest watched her with the same skeptical patience the town had shown, like men who had learned not to get used to a woman on this mountain because they never stayed. She also learned the house, not the physical dimensions of it she had that within 2 days, but the emotional topography of it, the way you learn a place by feeling where it aches. And this house ached everywhere. There were no curtains on the windows that faced west. There was no picture on any wall. There was no chair near the fireplace that clearly belonged to someone who liked to sit and read or think. There was no comfort anywhere, not one object that had been chosen for any reason other than function. And the effect of all that functionalism was a house that felt less like a home and more like something a person was enduring. She started with the kitchen window. She had brought one thing from Ohio that was not practical, a piece of pale yellow fabric her mother had given her years ago, saying she might want it someday. She had carried it in her trunk, not knowing why, knowing only that she couldn't leave it. She measured the window by eye and cut the fabric and hung it, and the morning light came through it, yellow and warm, and the kitchen looked for the first time like somewhere a person might want to be. She heard him stop in the kitchen doorway the morning after she hung it. She was at the stove and she didn't turn around. She listened to the silence. He didn't say anything. He poured his coffee. He went outside. She told herself that was fine. The second week she found seeds in the bottom of a crate in the barn. Wildflower seeds, old but maybe still viable, and she planted them along the porch railing in the window boxes that had been sitting there empty and weather gray for what looked like years. Billy watched her do it from the barn door and called over, "He ain't gonna like that, ma'am." "He might not," she said pleasantly, pressing seeds into soil. "But I do." Billy laughed. It was the first genuine laughter she'd heard on that mountain. Colton came out that evening and stopped at the porch steps and looked at the window boxes for a long time. She was sitting on the porch with her mending, watching him without appearing to, and she saw his face move through something she couldn't quite read. Not anger, not approval, something in between or underneath both of those. He looked at her. He looked at the boxes. He went inside. 3 days later, she found him at dawn before she was up standing at the porch railing. When she pushed open the door, he didn't startle. He just stood there looking at the boxes. "Won't know if they'll come up for another few weeks," she said. "I know," he said. He didn't move, and she didn't move, and the mountain morning was cold and still around them. "My wife planted things," he said. Not to her exactly. More like a sentence that needed to be said aloud, and she happened to be there. She had a... He stopped. She liked growing things. It was the most he had said to her at one time since she arrived. "Tell me about her," Margaret said quietly. His hands tightened on the railing. "Another time," he said. He went inside to start his day. She stood on the porch alone and understood something she hadn't fully grasped before. There had been a wife. The agency letter had said widower, and she had registered it as a fact of circumstance. But standing on that porch at dawn, it became real in a different way. Not a fact about his history, but a wound in his present something. He was still living inside of something he had built this entire silent fortress around. The 6 women who had come before her had walked into a house that was still a shrine to someone who wasn't there anymore, even if no one could see the shrine. No pictures. No objects kept for sentiment. The opposite of a shrine, a place scrubbed clean of evidence. Because sometimes the way you keep grief is by removing every single thing that might make it visible. Because if you can see it, you have to feel it. Margaret went inside and made breakfast and didn't say anything about it. But she began to understand the shape of what she was working with. At the end of the 3rd week, one of the men from town came up the mountain on horseback. Margaret was in the kitchen garden. She'd started one small, just herbs, and some late root vegetables when she heard the hoofbeats. She looked up and recognized the man from the street in Pine Creek, one of the ones who'd been watching when she stepped off the stagecoach. He had a particular kind of face, the kind that had decided it was amusing to have opinions about other people. He reined his horse up and looked down at her with that face. "Still here, then," he said. "Still here," she agreed. She kept working. "Colton around. He's in the far field. I can send word if it's urgent." He looked her over in the slow, deliberate way that some men used to make women feel examined. She had learned long ago not to react to it. "You know he's going to send you packing same as the rest," the man said. "Probably sooner given—" He trailed off with a particular gesture that was not quite a shrug. Margaret stood up straight. She looked at him with the same steady gaze she'd used on Colton that first day on the street. "Given what?" she said. He had the good sense to look slightly uncomfortable. "Just saying it ain't an easy life up here for a woman." "No," she said. "I imagine it isn't. Was there something I could pass to Mr. Hayes or not?" He said he'd come back, and he rode away, and Margaret went back to her garden with her hands steadier than her chest, which was moving a little fast the way it always did, when she had to hold herself completely still on the outside while something was moving hard on the inside. She heard boots behind her and turned to find Colton standing at the garden gate. He had come back from the far field early. She didn't know how long he'd been there. His face was unreadable as always, but there was something in the set of his jaw. "That was Harlan Peck," he said. "He doesn't have any business on this mountain that concerns you." "He had something to say," she said mildly. "What did he say?" She considered it. "That I'd be leaving soon." In not exactly those words. Colton said nothing for a moment. He looked at where Harlan's horse had gone. He looked back at her, and she saw there just briefly something that might have been anger on her behalf. It was gone before she could be sure. "He's wrong," Colton said. Margaret blinked. He was already walking back toward the barn. She stood in the garden for a moment, those 2 words sitting in her chest, in a way that was completely disproportionate to their size. "He's wrong. Not you can go if you want." Not silence. Not the careful blankness he usually gave her when she was anywhere near personal territory. "He's wrong." She went back to her herbs and she was smiling privately in a way she let herself feel but didn't need to show. 4 weeks in. She had cleared the weeks of grime from the windows, real grime, years of it. The kind that accumulates when nobody cares to look out, and the afternoon light now came into the parlor in a way that changed the whole character of the room. She had repaired the torn curtain in the upstairs hall. She had reorganized the kitchen so that things lived where you'd logically reach for them instead of wherever they'd ended up. Small changes, nothing dramatic, nothing that erased what the house had been. Just things that made it begin to breathe differently. She noticed Colton noticing. He never said anything directly, but she would catch him pausing in a doorway, looking at the light in the parlor, or reaching for something in the kitchen and finding it exactly where he would have put it himself. She saw something happen in his face in those moments, a very small thing, a softening that was over almost before it began, but it was there. And she saw more than once that when Billy and Chet and the other men came in for a meal, that she had made, Colton watched them the way you watch people eating something that matters to you. Like the food was not just fuel, but something he was invested in them receiving well. She was starting to see who he actually was, underneath the economy of words and the walls, and the efficiency and the list. Not a cold man. A man who had loved someone and lost her, and who had decided that the only way to survive that was to need nothing, to allow himself to be needed by others only in the most transactional way, and to build the walls so high and smooth that nobody could find the door. She saw him sit up with a sick horse half the night, talking to it quietly, in a voice so different from his ordinary voice that she stopped in the dark and just stood there listening to it. She saw him walk back to the bunkhouse on a cold night to make sure the youngest ranch hand, a boy of barely 16, who was new to the work, had enough blankets. She saw him on the day a traveling peddler came through, quietly, buy a small tin of hard candies and leave them on the kitchen table without a word. And she understood instinctively that he had bought them for her without being able to say so directly. She ate one and left the tin where it was, and the next morning half of them were gone, and she chose to believe he'd eaten them in the small hours when no one was watching, which told her something about the scale of what he was dealing with. A man who couldn't even let himself enjoy candy in front of another person. A man who had decided somewhere very deep that want was dangerous. On the 5th week, it was a Sunday, and she was sitting on the porch in the late afternoon with a book she had brought from Ohio, one of the few things she had allowed herself in her one trunk. And Colton came out and sat in the other chair, the one he never sat in, the one that looked like it had belonged to someone else. And for a long time, neither of them said anything, which was not unusual, except that the quality of the silence was different. It was companionable. She could feel it. It was no longer the silence of two strangers enduring each other's presence. It was something else, something she hadn't entirely expected to find this soon. "You read a lot?" he asked. She looked up. "When I can. Do you?" He looked out at the mountain. "Used to. Haven't much. Not in a while." "What did you read?" Another pause. She had gotten used to his pauses, learned to hear them not as walls, but as the actual space in which he formed sentences, which took him longer than other people because he said only exactly what he meant, and he required time to know what that was. "History mostly," he said. "Some of the old explorers, Lewis and Clark, Fremont. Men who went into places nobody had gone before," she said. "Yes." She looked back at her book. She said, almost to herself, "I think I understand that." She heard him shift in his chair. "I have some of them still," he said. "In the study, if you wanted." She looked at him over the top of her book. He was looking at the mountain. "I'd like that very much," she said. He nodded once, the way he agreed to things. She went back to reading. He stayed in that chair for another hour, not saying anything else, and the mountain turned orange and then purple around them, and she thought, this is what it looks like when a closed place starts to open. Not a dramatic gesture, not a declaration. Just a man sitting in a chair he hadn't allowed himself to sit in for a long time, next to a woman who had decided he was worth staying for. She had promised him 9 days, and she had beaten it. She had promised him 10, and she had beaten that too. The first month was ending, and she was still here, and she felt the mountain differently than she had the day she arrived. Still enormous, still cold and challenging, but familiar now, in the way that hard things become familiar when you refuse to let them win. She had her room and her seeds starting to come up now. Tiny green threads in the window boxes, and her yellow curtain and her book. She had Billy's occasional laughter, and Chet's gruff nod, and the slowly evolving education of learning what the land required. And she had Colton Hayes, who had not given her one warm word, and also had left candy on her kitchen table, and told Harlan Peck he was wrong, and sat in a dead woman's chair on a Sunday evening to tell her about books. That was enough. It was more than enough. It was, she thought, looking out at the darkening mountain with her hands folded in her lap, and her heart quieter than it had been in years, the beginning of something real. She was right about that too. But she didn't know yet how hard the real thing was going to have to get before it was finished being built, how the mountain was going to test what she'd come here to do in ways she hadn't imagined, and how the man in the chair beside her was going to be both the reason for the test and the only reason it would be worth passing. The seeds in the window boxes were 4 inches tall by the end of the month. Colton stood at the porch rail one morning and looked at them for a long moment before he went to start his day. "They're going to bloom," Margaret said from behind him. He was quiet for a moment. "I can see that," he said, and in his voice, barely underneath the words, something that might have been wonder. The seeds bloomed on a Tuesday. Margaret was in the kitchen when she heard Billy holler from the yard. Not an alarm holler, not the kind that made her drop everything and run, but the kind that meant something worth seeing. She dried her hands and went to the porch, and there they were, pale yellow and white, and a deep stubborn orange, small but unmistakable, crowding up out of the window boxes like they had been waiting for exactly this moment to make their argument. She stood at the porch rail and looked at them and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Something she'd almost forgotten was available to her. Pride. Not the complicated kind. The simple kind. The kind that comes from putting something into the ground, not knowing if it would take, and then finding out it did. She heard boots behind her. She knew those boots. Colton stopped at the top of the porch steps and looked at the window boxes and said nothing for long enough that Billy had drifted away and the yard was quiet again, and it was just the two of them standing in the morning with the flowers between them like a declaration. "I told you they would," she said, not crowing, just stating the fact. "You did," he said. She waited to see if there was more. There wasn't. He went down the steps and across the yard to the barn, and she watched him go and noticed the thing she had started noticing, the slight pause before he cleared the barn door. The almost turn that wasn't quite a turn, the fraction of a second where he seemed to consider something and then keep walking. She went back inside and let herself smile fully where no one could see it. That same afternoon, something happened that changed the temperature of everything. She was in the study. Colton had told her she could use it to read, and she had taken him at his word carefully in the way she was learning to take everything he offered when she found the photograph. It was not displayed. It was not hidden exactly, but it was placed face down inside the cover of one of the Explorer books, the kind of placement that says, "I cannot look at this, but I also cannot destroy it." She felt it when she pulled the book from the shelf, and the photograph slid out and landed on the desk. She looked at it. The woman in the photograph was small and dark-haired, and she was laughing at something outside the frame caught mid-laugh, and she had Colton's same quality of stillness about her, even in the moment of laughter, or maybe Margaret was reading that in projecting it. She had a feeling the woman in the photograph had been the kind of person who laughed often and loudly and without apology, which was maybe part of why Colton's silence now was so total, because he was filling the absence of that laughter with nothing, because nothing was the only thing that didn't make the comparison painful. Margaret set the photograph back exactly as she'd found it, face down, inside the cover. She pushed the book back onto the shelf. She sat with the book she'd actually come for, and she read for an hour, and she did not take the photograph out again. But she thought about it. She thought about the woman who had grown things, who had laughed at something outside the frame, who had left this man alone on a mountain with a heart that had locked itself and thrown the key somewhere he couldn't find it. She thought about what it meant that he'd kept the photograph, that he'd put it somewhere he didn't have to see it, but hadn't put it somewhere he might lose it. That evening at supper, she said, "What was her name?" Colton looked up from his plate. Something moved behind his eyes. Not surprise, she thought, but the particular expression of someone who has been waiting for a question and is not sure they're ready for it to arrive. "Clara," he said. "How long ago?" 4 years. A pause. "This spring, it'll be 5. She nodded. She picked up her fork. She didn't push further, and she felt him noticing that she didn't push, and she thought the not pushing was probably more important right now than anything she might have said. "She would have liked those flowers," he said, very quiet, almost to his food. Margaret looked at him across the table, and the look she gave him was not pity and was not sentiment, but was something more honest than either. "Tell me one thing about her," she said. Just one thing, whatever comes to your mind. His jaw worked. His hands were still on the table beside his fork. She couldn't cook to save her life, he said. It was so completely unexpected that Margaret laughed before she could stop it. A real laugh surprised out of her, and she saw something extraordinary happen. The corner of Colton Hayes's mouth moved. Just barely. Just the one corner. In a direction that on any other man she would have called the beginning of a smile. Terrible, she asked. Catastrophic, he said. The word came out with a weight to it that was almost fond. She knew it. She didn't care. She burned everything and served it anyway and expected you to be grateful for the effort. Were you? Always, he said. And the word fell into the space between them like a stone into still water. And they both felt the ripples, and neither of them said anything after that. But the silence at the table was different from any silence that had been in that house in what Margaret suspected was a very long time. She washed the dishes. She heard him in the study. When she passed the doorway to say goodnight, she saw the Explorer book was open on his desk. She didn't check whether the photograph was still inside it. She went upstairs, and she lay in her plain cold room and looked at the ceiling, and thought that grief was the strangest kind of love, how it kept the shape of the person even after the person was gone, and how living with someone's grief was a form of knowing them before you actually knew them. She thought she was beginning to know Colton Hayes. The following week, Harlan Peck came back. This time, he didn't come alone. He came with 2 other men from town, and they rode up in the late morning when Colton was in the far pasture and wouldn't be back until midday, and Margaret was the only person near the house because Billy and Chet were with Colton. The new hand, the 16-year-old named Thomas, who she'd taken to leaving extra bread for without comment, had gone to fill the water barrels at the creek. 3 men on horses looking down at her in the yard. Harlan's face was wearing that particular expression she had identified as the one he put on when he wanted to seem reasonable while doing something unreasonable. Morning? He said, pleasant as weather. Colton home. He's working, she said. Same as most mornings. We'll wait then. I'll pass a message, she said. Harlan smiled in the way that meant he was not interested in a message. Actually, he said, shifting in his saddle, there's something you might be able to help us with since you're managing the house and all. He made managing the house sound like a thing you'd say about a chair arrangement. There's been some talk in town, some concern, about the ranch finances. She looked at him steadily. Those would be between Mr. Hayes and his banker. Normally, yes. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded paper. Except that Colton has a loan coming due. Property loan. Been outstanding for 3 years now. Bank wants a decision about the collateral. He held out the paper. Thought he might like a chance to discuss options before the formal notice arrives. She did not take the paper. She looked at Harlan Peck, at the 2 men flanking him, at the way they were arranged. Not the arrangement of men delivering paperwork, but the arrangement of men expecting to be invited inside. She thought about the ranch, the scale of it, the years of work in every outbuilding, and she thought about a man already living inside a 5-year grief who now had men like this coming to his door. Leave the paper with me, she said. I'll give it to him. Harlan looked at her for a moment, assessing. Then he leaned down and held the paper out, and she took it from him, her face giving him nothing. You know, he said conversationally, not moving to leave. Most of us in town figured you'd be gone by now. Figured the mountain would have done what it usually does. She said. Resilient woman, he said, and made it sound like an accusation. Thank you, she said, and made it sound like she meant it. Safe ride back, Mr. Peck. He held her gaze for 3 more seconds, then turned his horse. The other 2 followed. She stood in the yard and watched them go, and didn't let herself move until they were out of sight, and then she went into the house and sat at the kitchen table and unfolded the paper. It was a loan notice. Formal, dense with legal language, but she had done enough bookkeeping in Ohio to understand the architecture of it. The ranch carried a significant debt borrowed 3 years ago, a year after Clara died, she noted against the property. The interest had been paid sporadically. The principal had not been reduced. The bank was requesting a meeting to discuss the status of the loan and the property standing as collateral. She folded it back along its creases and set it in the middle of the table and sat with it. When Colton came in at noon, she was still at the table, and the paper was still in the middle of it. He saw it before he saw her expression. He came to the table and picked it up, and she watched his face as he read it, the particular compression of his jaw, the very slight change in his breathing, the way a man looks when something confirms a fear he has been carrying quietly. "Harlan Peck brought it," she said. "Came with 2 others. You were in the pasture." He set the paper down. "He came to the house," he said, not a question. "He said he thought you'd want to see it before the formal notice." Colton's jaw moved. "That's not why he came." "No," she agreed. "I don't think it was either." He was quiet for a long moment. He hadn't sat down. He was standing at the table looking at the notice with an expression she had never seen on him before, not the controlled blankness, not the quiet guardedness, but something rawer than that. Something that looked like a man confronting the thing he'd been trying not to look at directly. "How bad?" she asked quietly. He looked at her. "Bad," he said. "Just the one word. Tell me." "Margaret, tell me," she said again, even quieter, not pushing, not demanding, just leaving the door open. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, which was itself something the sitting the choosing to be at the same level instead of standing over the problem. He told her. It took a while, and it came out in Colton's way, not linear, not organized, but honest, which mattered more than organized. The loan had been taken out to cover operating costs in the year after Clara died. He had not been managing the ranch well that year. He had been managing grief, which is a full-time occupation that leaves nothing over for anything else. And by the time he came back to himself enough to look at the books, the debt was already structured in a way that made it difficult to address without a strong season or a sale of some portion of the land. There had not been a strong season, and he was not going to sell the land. "The bank," he said. "They want to talk about partial sale. The East Pasture. Harlan Peck wants the East Pasture. Has for years." "And you won't sell it to him," she said. "I won't sell it to him," he confirmed. "Why not the East Pasture specifically?" He looked at the table. "It's where Clara's family had their homestead, before her parents passed. It's where she—" He stopped. "I can't sell it to Harlan Peck. I can't sell it to someone who wants it for what's underneath the ground, not the—" He stopped again. "Not for what it means," she finished. He looked at her. He nodded once. She pulled the paper toward her and looked at it again, running the numbers in her mind, calculating in the way she'd learned to calculate from years of managing her mother's household finances on not nearly enough. She looked at the interest structure. She looked at the payment history. "You haven't missed a payment," she said. "No." "You've paid late, but you've paid every time." "Yes, that matters," she said. "The bank doesn't want to foreclose. Foreclosure is expensive and complicated, and they'd rather have a performing loan than a property problem. What they want is a plan. Something they can show says the debt will be resolved." She looked up. "What does the ranch need to have a strong season?" He blinked. "What? What does the operation need that it doesn't currently have? What's the limiting factor?" He stared at her. She looked back at him and waited. "The herd is too small," he said slowly, like a man pulling something up from deep water. "I sold down 3 years ago. Should have rebuilt by now. A larger herd would—" He stopped. "How do you know how to—" "My father owned a dry goods business," she said. "He died when I was 19, and my mother didn't know the first thing about accounts. I kept the books for 6 years." She paused. "I kept us out of debt for 6 years on an income that shouldn't have managed it." She looked at the notice again. "You need to write to the bank, this week before the formal notice arrives. Tell them you want a meeting to discuss restructuring the repayment terms and that you have a plan for rebuilding the herd. Then you need to have a plan." He was very still. "Do you actually know how to do that?" he said. "The writing to the bank." "Yes," she said simply. He looked at her for a long moment. "Why?" he said. She looked up. "Why what? Why does it matter to you?" He said. "What happens to this ranch? It was the most direct question he had ever asked her, and it sat in the room with real weight, and she understood that he was asking something larger than the financial question. He was asking why she was here, why she was still here, why she was sitting at his table, working on his problems, when 6 women before her had decided the problems weren't worth it. She set down the paper. "Because I made a choice to be here," she said. "And I don't make choices I'm not willing to stand behind." She held his gaze. "And because this place is worth saving, Colton. This ranch, what you built, it matters. And you know it matters, or you wouldn't have been carrying this alone for 3 years." He was quiet for a very long time. "I'll get the full ledger," he said. She nodded. He got up and went to the study and came back with a battered ledger book that he set on the table between them, and they spent the rest of that afternoon with the accounts spread out between them, and it was the first time in Margaret's life that doing arithmetic had felt like an act of intimacy. She drafted the letter to the bank that evening. She wrote it in her clear, careful hand, read it aloud to him across the supper table, and watched his face as he listened. He asked her to change 2 things. She changed them. He read it again. "That's good," he said. "I'll copy it clean in the morning," she said. "You don't have to." "I want to," she said, simply directly in the way she said everything. He looked at her. The lamplight was between them, and outside the dark mountain was all around the house, and it was very quiet. And in the quiet, she saw something shift in him, not dramatically, not suddenly, but with the slow inevitability of something that has been leaning in a direction long enough to finally yield to gravity. "Margaret," he said. She waited. "I don't—" He stopped, tried again. "I'm not easy company." "I know," she said. "I've been told I'm not." He stopped again. "Warm," she offered. "Welcoming, forthcoming, demonstrative." She tilted her head slightly. "I believe impossible was one of the words I heard in town." Something happened at the corner of his mouth again. "That sounds right," he said. "I'm not looking for easy," she said. "I didn't travel 2,000 miles looking for easy." She looked at him steadily, the way she had on the street that first day, the way she had across every supper table in 6 weeks of suppers. "I was looking for real. And you are very, very real, Colton Hayes. That's enough for me." He said nothing. But he didn't look away, and that was its own kind of answer. She went upstairs. She lay in her room and listened to the mountain, and thought that something had turned today. Some slow gear in a large mechanism had moved one tooth forward, and the movement was quiet and significant, and she felt it in a way she didn't entirely have words for yet. In the morning, the letter was gone from the kitchen table. She found it propped against the lamp in the study, sealed and addressed, ready to go to town. He had copied it himself. She stood in the study doorway looking at it and felt something warm move through her chest like the first hour of sun on a cold day. She went and made breakfast. 2 weeks later, the bank wrote back requesting a meeting. Colton went to town alone. He came back in the late afternoon, came into the kitchen where she was starting supper, hung his coat and his hat, washed his hands. She waited and did not ask. "They agreed to the restructuring," he said. 90 days to present a rebuild plan for the herd. If the plan is viable, they extend the terms." She exhaled. "That's good news," she said. "It is." He stood at the basin with his back to her. "The man at the bank, Harding, he said the letter was professionally done. Asked if I'd had help with it." "What did you tell him?" A pause. "Told him I had a capable wife." She went very still. He still had his back to her. She couldn't see his face. Wife. He had said wife. Not housekeeper, not the woman out at my place, not the mail order from Ohio. Wife. In a bank to a man named Harding as a plain fact and not a question. "Good," she said. Her voice was perfectly steady. "That's good." He turned around then. He looked at her across the kitchen, and she looked back at him, and the word was still in the air between them, and neither of them moved to address it directly, but neither of them moved away from it either. And that was exactly as it should be, she thought. That was exactly right. He sat at the table. She put supper on. They ate. Outside the mountain. Evening came down around the house, and the curtain she'd made from her mother's yellow fabric moved in the draft from the window she'd cracked open. And across the yard, the window boxes were full of blooms that nobody had expected to grow. The next morning, Thomas, the 16-year-old, came to her before breakfast, with his hat in his hands and a cut on his forearm that had gone 3 days without being properly tended. "Didn't want to bother Mr. Hayes," the boy said, looking at his boots. She cleaned and wrapped the cut and fed him and sent him out with an extra biscuit in his pocket, and thought about what it meant that the boy had come to her, had trusted her with something small and necessary, had known she would take care of it without making it larger than it was. She was becoming a person this mountain knew. That mattered to her more than she would have predicted. She was working the kitchen garden on a Thursday when she overheard something she wasn't meant to hear. Billy and Chet were on the other side of the fence, not knowing she was there, and Billy's voice came through clearly. "Don't think she's going anywhere." Chet's grunt. "Don't think so either." "Different from the others." "Yep." "You think he sees it?" A pause. Then Chet's voice, slower, more deliberate. "Saw him watching her from the barn door this morning. Just standing there, watching her hang the washing." Another pause. "Man hasn't watched anything without a work reason behind it in 4 years. So, yeah, I think he's starting to see it." She crouched over her garden and kept her hands moving and said nothing, and felt something enormous and quiet move through her. That evening, Colton came to the porch where she was sitting and sat in the chair that was becoming his chair again, the chair he was reclaiming one Sunday at a time. And he sat with his coffee, and he looked at the blooms in the window boxes in the last light, and he said, "Billy said you wrapped Thomas's arm." "It needed tending," she said. "He should have come to me." "He was afraid of bothering you." Colton looked at the window boxes. "I know," he said, and it came out with a heaviness that said he knew, and he understood what that meant, and it cost him something to hear it said plainly. "You're not frightening," she said without looking at him. "You're just very large and very quiet, and you don't smile much. To a 16-year-old boy, those things add up to frightening." A long pause. "What do they add up to for you?" he said. She looked at him, then directly the way she always looked at him when the question deserved a real answer. "Someone working very hard to protect himself," she said, "from something that happened that he didn't deserve." The muscle in his jaw moved. He looked back at the mountain. "Clara died in the winter," he said, very quietly, not looking at her. "Fever. Fast. I was in the far pasture when it—" He stopped. "When I got back she was already—" He stopped again. She didn't speak. She let the silence hold what he'd said. "I've never told anyone that," he said. "Not the part about the pasture." "You didn't know," she said. "No." "If you'd been there, you couldn't have stopped the fever." "No," he said. "But I would have." He looked at his hands. "I would have been there." She thought about that. About the particular cruelty of grief that isn't just about the loss, but about the exact geography of where you were standing when it happened. About how a man could punish himself for years for being in the wrong pasture on the wrong afternoon, for being too far away to say goodbye, for being the kind of person whose work kept him distant, and how that distance had become evidence of something he couldn't forgive himself for. "Colton," she said. He looked at her. "She knew," Margaret said. Whatever else she knew. He looked at her for a very long time. She held his gaze and didn't soften it or qualify it and didn't look away. Then he looked back at his hands and he set down his coffee and he stood up and she thought he was going to go inside. Instead, he stood at the porch rail with his back to her and his hands on the rail, and she heard him breathe. Just that. Just the sound of a man breathing through something. "It's getting cold," he said finally, in a voice that had changed very slightly, in a way she wasn't sure he knew had changed. "You should go in." "In a minute," she said, and turned a page in her book. He stood at the rail a while longer. Then he went inside, and she heard his boots on the stairs and the quiet of the house settling around her. and she sat on the porch in the cold with her book and the darkening mountain, and she felt with a certainty she hadn't expected to feel this soon that something enormous had just happened in the space between two people, and that the enormousness of it was going to take both of them a while to understand. She went inside when the cold became serious. The lantern in the study was still lit. She paused at the bottom of the stairs. Through the half-open study door, she could see the edge of the desk, the lamp, and the Explorer book spine out on the shelf exactly where it lived. She went upstairs. She did not check whether the photograph was still face down. She already knew it wasn't. The photograph was on the desk the next morning, not face down, not tucked inside a book. Standing upright, leaning against the lamp base, Clara's laughing face turned toward the window, and the morning light exactly like someone had decided she'd been in the dark long enough. Margaret saw it when she passed the study doorway on her way to the kitchen. She didn't stop. She didn't say anything. She went and started the coffee and stood at the stove with her back to the hall, and let herself feel the full weight of what that small change meant, because it meant something enormous, and she was not going to pretend otherwise, even inside her own chest. Colton came downstairs 20 minutes later. He poured his coffee. He sat at the table. He looked at his hands around the cup, the way he did when he was organizing something in his mind. "I need to go to town today," he said. "Bank wants the first draft of the herd rebuild plan by end of month. Need to talk to a man about cattle prices." "I'll have breakfast ready in 10 minutes," she said. "Margaret." She turned from the stove. He was looking at her. Directly the way he'd looked at her on the porch last night, when the air between them had changed and neither of them had named it. "Thank you," he said, "for what you said last night." She held his gaze. "I meant it." "I know you did." He looked back at his cup. "That's why." She turned back to the stove and finished the eggs, and they ate together in the morning quiet, and she thought that this was what it looked like when a man decided to stop punishing himself at least for one morning. It didn't look dramatic. It looked like a man drinking his coffee and saying two words across a kitchen table, and meaning every syllable of both of them. He left for town after breakfast. She watched the wagon go down the switchback road, and then she went to the study and stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at Clara's photograph in the morning light, and she said very quietly to no one in particular, "I'll take good care of him." Then she went to do the accounts. He was back by late afternoon, and he was not alone. She heard the wagon, and then a second horse, and she came to the porch and saw Colton climbing down from the wagon, and behind him, on a dark bay mare, was a woman Margaret had not seen before. Late 50s, sharp-faced, with the posture of someone who had spent a lifetime being right about things and expected you to know it. She looked at the house. She looked at the window boxes. She looked at Margaret on the porch with an expression that was doing several things at once and not quite committing to any of them. Colton came up the steps. His face was carefully neutral in the way that meant something was complicated. "This is Vera Whitmore," he said. "She runs the millinery in town. She was Clara's aunt." The woman Vera had dismounted and was at the bottom of the porch steps, now looking up at Margaret with those assessing eyes. "So you're the one who lasted," Vera said. Not warmly, not unkindly, just as a plain fact being confirmed. "I am," Margaret said. "Heard you fixed the kitchen. And the study curtain, and the window boxes." Vera looked at the window boxes. Something shifted in her face, fast controlled, but Margaret caught it. The flowers had meant something to her before they meant anything to anyone else on this mountain. "Clara used to grow things," Vera said. "I know," Margaret said. Vera looked at her sharply. "He told you." "A little. Enough." The older woman studied her for another long moment, the kind of study that is less about seeing and more about deciding. Then she climbed the porch steps and said, "I suppose I'll have some of that coffee if there is any," and walked past Margaret into the house as though she'd been there 100 times, which she probably had. Margaret looked at Colton. He was watching her with an expression that was almost apologetic. "She came to the bank," he said quietly. "Heard I was there. Followed me out." "It's all right," Margaret said. "She's—" "I know," Margaret said. "Come inside." She made coffee. She put out the bread she'd baked that morning. She sat at the table with Vera Whitmore and Colton Hayes, and she let the older woman run the conversation, because this was Vera's visit and Vera's grief and Vera's need to look at the person who was living in her niece's house and decide what to make of her. Vera asked direct questions. She asked where Margaret was from and what her family situation was and what her skills were, and whether she found the mountain difficult. Margaret answered all of them without hedging, and she watched Vera's face recalibrate slightly with each answer, the way a sharp mind adjusts its assessments as new information comes in. Then Vera said, "Why did you stay?" Margaret looked at her. "Because I don't quit. Other women didn't quit either. They just found there was nothing here worth staying for." "With respect," Margaret said, "I think they found there was nothing they could see worth staying for. That's different." Vera's eyes narrowed. Colton was very still. "You think you see something they didn't," Vera said. "I think I was willing to look longer than they were," Margaret said. "I'm not criticizing them. The mountain is hard. He is—" She glanced at Colton, who was watching her with that expressionless face that she now knew was not expressionless at all. "He is not easy to know, but there is a great deal worth knowing once you stop waiting for him to hand it to you." The room was quiet. Vera looked at Colton. "You hear that?" "I heard it," he said. "Good." Vera picked up her coffee. She looked out the window at the blooms in the window boxes. "Clara would have liked her," she said, "to Colton, not to Margaret. Like Margaret wasn't there, or like she was someone you could talk about openly because she'd already passed some test you'd been administering without announcing it." "I think so too," Colton said, quietly, simply. Margaret picked up her own coffee and did not let herself react to that in any visible way. She picked up her cup, and she breathed, and she thought that somewhere in this conversation a door had been opened that hadn't been opened before, and walking through it was going to change the shape of what she was building here, in a way she hadn't fully anticipated but wasn't sorry for. Vera left before dark. She paused at the porch steps and looked at Margaret with that sharp face and said, "I'll come back next week if that's acceptable." "The coffee will be ready," Margaret said. Vera almost smiled. Almost. She rode away down the mountain, and Margaret stood on the porch watching her go, and felt Colton come to stand beside her. "She never came up here," he said. "After Clara. Not once in 5 years." Margaret looked at him. "She came today," she said. He looked at the road where Vera had disappeared. "Yes," he said. "She did." 3 days later, the storm announced itself in the way mountain storms do, not gradually, but all at once, a pressure change in the air so sudden and complete that every animal on the ranch felt it before the sky showed a single cloud. Margaret felt it too in the way you feel the air before lightning, a heaviness behind her eyes and a restlessness she couldn't account for. She came out of the kitchen and found Colton already in the yard looking north, his hat pushed back on his head, and his face reading the sky with the fluency of a man who'd been reading this particular sky for most of his life. "How bad?" she asked. "Bad," he said. He lowered his eyes from the sky and moved immediately, no hesitation, into the voice he used when things needed to happen fast. "Billy, get the horses in. All of them. Thomas, check the bunkhouse roof. That north corner hasn't been right since August. Chet." She didn't wait to hear the rest. She went to the kitchen and started banking the cook fire for a long burn, checked the wood box half full. Not enough, pulled her coat on, and went to the wood pile and started stacking. She was on her 4th armload when Colton appeared beside her and took the wood out of her arms without a word and carried it in, and she picked up another load, and they worked like that for 20 minutes in a wordless efficiency that felt like something they'd been doing together for years. The sky went green. Not gradually. Green all at once, the particular color that the mountain made before it showed you what it could do. "Get inside," Colton said. "One more load." Margaret. His hand was on her arm. The first time he had touched her, she realized. His grip was firm and not rough and completely certain. "Inside. Now." She went. The storm hit an hour later, and it hit with everything it had. She had never heard wind like that inside a house before. Not whether outside walls, but something that seemed to want the walls themselves, that pushed at them with a sustained intentional force that made the whole house creak and settle and creak again. She stayed in the kitchen because the kitchen was the warmest room and the most central, and she cooked because cooking was what she did when she needed to do something with her hands, and she made enough food for twice the number of people on the mountain because she didn't know what the night was going to require. Colton came in twice, coated in snow to confirm things. The horses were secure, the bunkhouse was holding, Thomas's corner had been reinforced before the worst hit. He drank the coffee she poured him, standing up still in his coat, and went back out both times, and she stood at the window she'd cleaned and watched the white nothing, and told herself he knew this mountain better than the storm did. On his third trip in, he was favoring his left side. She saw it before he sat down, before he even made it fully through the door. The slight change in the way he was carrying himself, the controlled way he was breathing, the hand that went to his ribs when he thought she wasn't looking. "Sit down," she said. "I'm fine." "Colton, sit down." He sat. He did it with the particular stubbornness of a man who knows he needs to and resents the needing, and when she came to him and put her hands at the hem of his coat, he went very still, but he didn't stop her. The left side of his shirt was dark. "Something hit you," she said. "Fence post came loose in the wind." His voice was even. "It's not. Let me see it." "Margaret." "I have cleaned worse," she said. "I am not going to faint. Let me see it." He let her see it. It was a deep gash along his left side ribs, to hip the kind that needed cleaning and binding, and watching. Not the kind that needed a doctor tonight, but absolutely the kind that would become the kind that needed a doctor if it was ignored. She got the medical kit she'd organized in the first week because she had noticed there wasn't one, and had made one from what she could find in the pantry, and what she'd thought to pack in her trunk before she left Ohio. She cleaned the wound with steady hands, and she felt him holding himself very still under her hands, not in pain, or not only in pain, but in the particular stillness of someone unused to being cared for. "You should make noise if it hurts," she said. "It doesn't hurt," he said. "It does hurt." A pause. "Reckon it does," he admitted. "But I don't need to make noise about it." She almost smiled. She kept working. "Who took care of you before, when you were hurt?" "Managed." "On your own?" "Yes." She tied off the bandage and sat back and looked at him. He was pale under his color, and the controlled breathing was working hard. She put her hand on his forehead, not medical, or not only medical, and felt his temperature, and watched his eyes, and he let her do it, which was its own entire conversation. "You don't have to manage alone," she said. Very quietly, he looked at her. The kitchen was loud with storm, and the lamp was burning, and his face in the lamplight was open in a way she had not seen it before. Not the controlled blankness, not the watchfulness, but something unguarded and a little lost the way faces get when the body has used up all its resources for other things and has nothing left to spend on walls. "I know," he said. And the two words were doing what his words always did, carrying more weight than their size, more weight than most men's sentences of 20 words. She made him eat. He argued about it mildly and then ate, which was the pattern she was learning. Mild argument followed by compliance, when he recognized the argument was pointless, and there was something almost fond in the pointlessness, like the argument was a form of contact. Outside, the storm doubled down on itself, and inside the house, the fire burned, and the food was warm, and Margaret sat across the table from Colton Hayes, and they talked. Not about the ranch, not about the bank, or the loan, or Harlan Peck, or any of the things that pressed on them from the practical world. They talked the way people talk when a storm has stripped away all the reasons to be careful, when the wind is loud enough that the inside feels like the only real place, when the person across the table is the only other person in the world for the duration of the night. He told her about his father, who had been harder than this mountain, in the particular way that men become hard when a woman leaves them. His mother had gone when Colton was 11, gone back to the city she'd come from, because the mountain had asked too much of her for too many years, and his father had watched her go from the porch with no expression on his face, and had never spoken her name again, and had taught Colton by example and by silence that love was something you survived, not something you kept. "You believed that," Margaret said. "I tried to," he said. "Then I met Clara." He was quiet. "And I thought maybe he was wrong. Maybe it was just him. Maybe I was different enough." "And then she died," Margaret said. "And then she died," he confirmed. He looked at his hands. "And I thought it proved him right after all. You love something, you lose it. You need someone, they go. So you stop needing." "Except you can't actually stop," she said. He looked up. "You can stop showing it," she said. "You can stop letting people see it. But the needing doesn't go anywhere. It just—" She looked for the word. "It pressurizes, like a closed room with too much in it." He stared at her. "Where did you learn that?" he said. "From being a woman in Ohio for 28 years, she said. "From being told in 100 different ways that what I needed was inconvenient, and what I felt was too much, and who I was the wrong size and shape for polite society." She looked at him steadily. "I know what it looks like when someone has been told over and over that their needs are a problem. It looks like you." The storm screamed at the windows. The fire popped. He looked at her across the table with an expression she had no name for, yet something that was not quite grief and not quite relief, and not quite anything she could map onto the faces she knew. Something that was Colton Hayes specifically, and nothing else. "Margaret," he said. "Yes." "I'm glad you didn't leave," he said. She breathed. "I know," she said. "I'm glad too." Then the roof on the south side of the barn let go. They heard it from the kitchen, a crack, and then a sustained rushing sound. Not the wind exactly, but the wind, getting inside something. It shouldn't be inside, and Colton was on his feet before she could speak. "Colton, your side." "Billy's in that barn," he said. He was already at his coat. She was right behind him. He turned and looked at her with that direct look, and she looked back at him with the same one, and he understood there was no argument to be had, and they went out together into the storm. She could not describe what the storm was like. She didn't try. She moved behind Colton because he knew where he was going, and she couldn't see 3 feet in front of her, and she held on to his coat and felt him moving forward with certainty, and she trusted the certainty even though she couldn't see anything to trust. The barn was intact enough. The roof had lost a section on the south end, not the whole thing, and Billy was inside unhurt, holding 2 horses by their halters and talking to them in the nonsense voice that worked on horses, and apparently on people too, because Margaret felt herself breathe easier the moment she heard it. Thomas was there too, crouched in a corner with a lantern, his eyes huge. "Everyone whole," Colton said. "Yes, sir," Billy said. "Horses are skittish, but—" "Keep them talking," Colton said. He was already looking at the roof breach, calculating it, his jaw moving through the problem, the way she'd seen him move through the bank numbers. "We need to get something over that opening before we lose more heat. Margaret, there's canvas in the east corner," she said. She'd put it there. Weeks ago, reorganizing storage, she'd moved the heavy canvas tarp to the east corner because that was where it would be reachable from the ground. She'd done it without thinking about why, out of the same instinct that made her put the medical kit together and rotate the canned goods to front-facing and keep the wood box as full as the evening had time for. He stared at her. "East corner," he said. "Yes." He looked at her for 1 full second with an expression she didn't have time to analyze, and then he moved toward the east corner, and she went the other direction to help Billy with the horses, and the storm went on above them for another 3 hours, and every single person in that barn earned their right to be there. At 2 in the morning, the wind changed. Margaret felt it before she heard it. The quality of the pressure through the walls shifted, and the barn stopped shaking, like something afraid, and settled into a deep stillness that meant the worst of it had passed. She was sitting against a hay bale with Thomas asleep against her shoulder, which had happened so gradually she hadn't noticed until he was already out, and she had not moved because she was not going to wake a sleeping 16-year-old who had been frightened and useful in equal measure all night. Colton was across the barn, sitting against the opposite wall watching her. She had caught him watching her before Chet had told her about it. The barn door the watching, but this was different. This was direct unconcerned about being caught the watching of a man who had given up pretending he wasn't doing it. She looked back at him. "Go to sleep," he said quietly, not to wake the boy. "Pot calling the kettle," she said, the corner of his mouth. "I can't sleep in barns." "Since when?" "Since always. Clara used to say I was more awake in a barn at 2 in the morning than most men were at midday." He paused. She wasn't wrong. The way he said it, not with pain exactly, but with something that had changed from pain into something more like memory, the way a bruise changes into a scar. The tenderness still there, but different, less raw, told Margaret something important. He was talking about Clara differently than he had in the first weeks. Not with the careful avoidance of a man skirting a wound, but with the directness of a man who had decided the wound could be acknowledged without being reopened. "She sounds like she was very alive," Margaret said. "She was," he said. "She was the most alive person I ever knew." He was quiet. "You remind me of her sometimes." Margaret looked at him. "Not in the way you look," he said quickly, and then seemed to realize he'd said something revealing in the correction. "I mean the way you don't back down from things. The way you just—" He stopped, looked at the sleeping boy, and then back at her. She had that too. This particular way of standing in a problem, like she'd already decided it wasn't bigger than her. "Maybe it's not a coincidence," Margaret said. "Maybe that's the thing you recognize, because it's what you need someone to be." He was quiet for a long time. "Maybe," he said. And for Colton Hayes, maybe was practically a declaration. She slept eventually despite the barn and the cold, and Thomas's weight against her shoulder. She slept with the particular completeness that comes after hours of being useful in a crisis, the kind of sleep that doesn't need a soft bed to be deep. She woke to gray light and Colton gone and the sound of someone working on the barn roof, and when she came out into the post-storm morning, the world outside remade white and still, and so quiet after the hours of roaring noise that it felt like a held breath. She saw him up on the barn roof with boards and nails, and Billy handing things up his left side, clearly hurting and being entirely ignored. "Colton Hayes," she said, not loud. She didn't need loud. He looked down at her from the roof. His face was entirely unrepentant. "It needs doing," he said. "Your side needs resting." Side can rest when the barn is closed. She looked at him. He looked at her. Billy looked between them with the expression of a man watching something he finds both alarming and quietly entertaining. "Fine," she said. "Breakfast in 20 minutes. You'll eat before you do another hour of that." He held her gaze for 3 seconds. 20 minutes, he agreed. She went inside and made the largest breakfast she had made since arriving on this mountain, and every person on the ranch came in from the cold and ate it, and Colton sat at the head of the table and ate more than she had seen him eat at one sitting, and she sat at the other end and looked down the length of the table at the men and the boy, and the hot food and the warm kitchen, and she thought, "This is it. This is what a home is. This is what I came here to build." Then the sound of a horse came up the road fast, too fast for a social call. It was Vera Whitmore, and her face when she came through the door was the tightest Margaret had seen it, which was saying something given that Vera's face operated on a narrow range at the best of times. "Colton," she said. "Harlan Peck was at the bank this morning, first thing, before it was properly open." Colton set down his fork. "The storm," Vera said. "There are 3 ranches that came through bad. Peter's lost his whole east barn. The Lundgren family's house has roof damage. There's talk in town about a bank emergency session Harding is meeting with property holders today." She looked at Colton. Harlan was there, with a lawyer. The table was very quiet. "What kind of lawyer?" Colton said. "The kind you hire when you want to make an argument about land acquisition during a hardship period," Vera said flatly. "The kind you hire when you've been waiting for a catastrophic storm to give you leverage you didn't have before." Margaret was already standing. "What exactly is the legal basis?" she said to Vera. Vera looked at her with those sharp eyes. You know something about this. I know something about loan law, she said. I know something about property hardship clauses and what a bank can and cannot do during an emergency petition period. She looked at Colton. How quickly can we get to town? He was already on his feet. Hour and a half if the road is clear enough. Is your side? The side is fine. It is not fine, Margaret. He looked at her with that direct gaze, and in it was something she hadn't seen before. Not patience, not stubbornness, but urgency, and beneath the urgency, trust. Come with me. She was getting her coat before he finished the sentence. Vera looked between them as they moved, the controlled, efficient movement of two people who had learned each other's rhythms without entirely meaning to, and something crossed Vera's face that was not quite a smile, but was the predecessor of one. I'll ride ahead, Vera said. Delay Harding until you get there. Vera, Colton started. I've been delaying men I disagreed with for 50 years, she said, pulling on her gloves. I'm very good at it. She was out the door. Margaret tied her coat and looked at Colton. He was looking at the door Vera had gone through, and on his face was an expression she had learned to read as the particular softness he reserved for things that genuinely moved him, but that he could not allow himself to say out loud. She's fighting for the ranch, Margaret said. She's fighting for Clara's ranch, he said. Same thing now, she said. He looked at her. She held his gaze. Same thing now, she said again, quieter, and it was not a question. He reached out. His hand found hers and closed around it. Not a romantic gesture, not a declaration, just a grip, firm and certain and complete, the grip of a man holding on to something he has decided he is not letting go of. He held on for 3 seconds. Then he let go and went to get the wagon. She stood in the empty kitchen with the warmth of his hand still on hers and looked at the yellow curtain moving in the draft and the blooms flattened by the storm, but still there, still attached, still stubbornly in the boxes where she'd planted them. And she pulled on her gloves and went to meet whatever was coming next. Because that was what she did. She stayed. She stood. She met it, and for the first time since she had stepped off that stagecoach in Pine Creek, she was not standing alone. The road down the mountain was brutal after the storm. Colton drove, and Margaret sat beside him, and neither of them wasted words on the conditions, because the conditions were what they were, and words wouldn't change them. She held the seat rail with one hand, and the folded loan documents she'd grabbed from the study with the other, and she ran the legal language through her mind, the way she'd run account numbers, looking for the architecture of it, looking for where Harlan Peck's lawyer intended to put his weight, and where the structure would hold against that weight, and where it wouldn't. She had one advantage that Harlan Peck almost certainly had not accounted for. He did not know she could read, not just read reason, calculate. Argue from a document with the precision of someone who had spent 6 years keeping a failing business solvent through nothing but careful attention to what the papers actually said versus what people claimed they said. Harlan Peck had looked at her on that first day and seen a large woman from Ohio who had no business on a mountain, and he had continued seeing exactly that every time he came up the road, and that was his mistake, and she intended to use it. Tell me what you know about Harlan, she said. Colton's eyes stayed on the road. Wants the east pasture, has for years since before Clara died. There's a mineral deposit under that land, nothing enormous but enough. He's made 3 formal offers, all refused. Has he ever gone to the bank before? Once, 2 years ago. Harding turned him away, said the loan wasn't in default and there was no basis. He paused. Storm changes that. Peters and Lundgren both took significant damage last night. If Harlan can get Harding to declare a hardship emergency across multiple properties, he can petition for expedited debt resolution on properties he has acquisition interest in. It's been done before. She looked at him. You know the law on this. I looked into it, after the last time he came to Harding. And you didn't tell me. A pause. I didn't want to... He stopped. I was handling it. Alone, she said. Not accusing, just naming it. Yes, he said. Alone. She let that sit for exactly 3 seconds, and then moved past it because they were moving toward the problem, and backward-looking was a luxury for later. The hardship emergency petition requires proof of inability to service the debt going forward, not just current damage. One storm doesn't constitute inability. You've been paying. Late, but paying, every time. That matters in Harding's calculation. She unfolded the loan document against her knee. And there's a clause here, section 4, third paragraph, that gives the primary borrower right of first response to any third-party acquisition petition before the bank can move on it. Harlan's lawyer will know about that clause. The question is whether he's betting that you don't. Colton looked at her, then just briefly, just long enough. Do we have time to respond before the session? If Vera is doing what she said she was doing, Margaret said yes. Then we have time, he said. With a certainty about Vera that told her something about the older woman's reputation that she hadn't fully appreciated until now. Pine Creek was more awake than she had ever seen it. The storm had done that, brought people out into the streets in the particular way that disasters bring communities out, half from genuine concern, and half from the irresistible pull of watching what the storm had broken and what it hadn't. She felt people noticing her. As Colton brought the wagon up to the bank, felt the familiar current of assessment move through the crowd, but it was different now than it had been the day she stepped off the stagecoach. Not lesser exactly. Different in quality. She had been here long enough, been seen often enough in connection with Colton, often enough that the assessment now had to account for the fact that she was still here. That she had lasted. That the mountain hadn't sent her back. She saw it in the way one woman stopped her companion's arm and said something quiet and nodded in Margaret's direction. She saw it in the way the man outside the feed store tipped his hat. Small things, but real ones. Colton helped her down from the wagon this time, without her needing to manage it herself this time, with his hand at her arm as a matter of course, and they went into the bank together and found Vera Whitmore standing in the middle of the main room, with the posture of a woman who had been there long enough to own the space, talking to a short man in a good coat with the particular expression of someone being made to wait politely and hating every second of it. The short man was the lawyer. She could tell before anyone introduced him. Harding came out of his office when Colton came through the door, and his face showed relief before he controlled it, which told Margaret everything she needed to know about which side of this Harding was actually on. "Mr. Hayes," Harding said. He was a careful man, a bank man, the kind who had learned to be neutral as a professional obligation. "Glad you could make it down, given the weather." "We're fine," Colton said. "What's the situation?" The lawyer stepped forward. "Arthur Clemens," he said, "representing Mr. Peck's interests." He looked at Margaret with a polite blankness that was she recognized a performance. He had noticed her. He was choosing to perform, not noticing her. "Perhaps we could speak in private, Mr. Hayes. My wife is here." Colton said exactly the same way he'd said it to Harding at the bank the first time, except now it landed differently. Now there was nothing uncertain about it. No slight pause before wife, no quality of a man trying a word on to see how it fit. It fit. He knew it fit. Whatever needs discussing can be discussed. Clemens looked at Margaret with a small recalibration behind his eyes. "Of course," he said smoothly, "as you prefer." They went into Harding's office. Harlan Peck was already there, sitting in one of the chairs with the settled look of a man who had arranged things to his satisfaction. He looked at Margaret when she came in, and he looked at Colton, and he looked between them, and something moved in his face that she would have called unease if she'd thought him capable of it. "Didn't know you'd be bringing," he started. "My wife," Colton said. "Yes, I know you didn't know." Margaret sat down and put the loan documents on her knee and looked at Clemens with a polite, neutral expression and waited. Clemens laid it out efficiently. 3 properties damaged. Combined loan exposure to the bank exceeded a threshold that triggered a hardship review provision in the bank's charter. His client, as a standing member of the Pine Creek business community, was prepared to offer acquisition terms on the Hayes property, specifically the east pasture, as a priority, remaining acreage negotiable, that would resolve the loan balance entirely, and leave Mr. Hayes with the main house and sufficient working land for a reduced operation. He said all of this smoothly, professionally, without looking at Margaret once. She let him finish. She let the silence after he finished sit for 3 full seconds. Then, she said, Section 4, Paragraph 3 of the loan agreement specifies that the primary borrower has the right of formal response to any third-party acquisition petition within 30 days of written notice. Has that written notice been filed? Clemens looked at her. The performance of not noticing ended. The hardship review provision supersedes, he started. The hardship review provision applies to the bank's internal assessment of loan viability, she said in the same pleasant tone she used when she was telling Thomas his cut needed cleaning. It does not supersede the borrower's procedural rights under the loan agreement itself. Those are separate instruments. She looked at Harding. Am I reading this correctly, Mr. Harding? Harding looked at the document she held out to him. He looked at it for a moment with the careful attention of a man who was relieved to have a reason to take his time. You are, he said. Then no written notice has been filed, Margaret said, turning back to Clemens. Which means this meeting is premature from a procedural standpoint. Mr. Hayes's response rights haven't been triggered because the triggering instrument hasn't been served. The room was quiet. Harlan Peck's face had gone from settled to something considerably less settled. He looked at Colton. Where did you find my wife? Colton said, for the 3rd time, quieter this time, with a finality that closed the sentence like a door. Clemens recovered. They always recovered men like Clemens. It was what they were for. The procedural point is noted, he said without particular embarrassment. However, the underlying financial reality doesn't change. The loan is in a precarious position, and the storm has materially worsened. The loan has been serviced consistently, Margaret said. Late on 2 occasions, never missed. That's a matter of record. She looked at Harding again. Isn't it? It is, Harding said. He was looking at her with an expression that was moving steadily from surprise towards something that she would have called respect if she'd been feeling generous, which she was. A restructuring agreement is already in progress, she continued. The terms were discussed 2 weeks ago, and a rebuild plan for the herd operation is being developed. The bank has expressed willingness to extend terms on presentation of a viable plan. That conversation is ongoing and was ongoing before this storm, which means the hardship review provision, even if applicable, is being addressed through the proper channel, which is the existing restructuring dialogue. She paused. Mr. Peck's petition, when it is properly filed with the required written notice, giving Mr. Hayes his 30 days, will be considered in that context. Not in a context created by one storm and a lawyer who arrived at the bank before it was properly open. Vera made a sound. It was a very small sound, barely audible, but Margaret caught it, and it was unquestionably the sound of a woman who was enjoying herself. Clemens looked at her for a long moment. The professional blankness was intact, but something behind it had shifted the recalibration of a man encountering an opponent he had not prepared for because he had not known to prepare. You have a background in law, Mrs. Hayes, he said. Accounting, she said, and reading. Harlan Peck stood up. His face was flushed in a way that had moved past ordinary anger into the particular heat of a man who has been outmaneuvered in a room where he expected to have everything his own way, and who knows it, and hates that he knows it. This isn't finished, he said. To Colton, not to her. Looking at Colton, the way men like Harlan always looked at the man, even when the woman was the one who had just taken apart his argument board by board. No? Colton agreed. It isn't. He stood too unhurried at his full height, which in that office was considerable. But it's finished for today. When you've filed your written notice, we'll respond in the 30-day window. That's the process. He looked at Harlan with the expression she had first seen on the street in Pine Creek, the expression she'd initially read as blankness, and had since learned was not blankness at all, but absolute bedrock certainty. My ranch isn't going anywhere, Harlan. Wasn't going anywhere before the storm. Isn't going anywhere after it. Harlan left. Clemens gathered his papers with professional composure and followed. The room let out a breath that had been holding for 40 minutes. Harding sat back in his chair and looked at Margaret with undisguised assessment. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, "I want to revisit the restructuring terms when you have time." She looked at Colton. Colton looked at her with that expression, the one she still didn't fully have a name for, the one that had been building in pieces across all the weeks since the stagecoach, the seeds and the candy, and the chair on the porch, and the grip in the kitchen, and now this. And he said to Harding, but looking at her, "Name the day." They walked out of the bank into the cold morning air, and Vera was behind them, and she put her hand briefly on Margaret's arm, a fast touch firm, Vera-like in its economy, and said nothing, because Vera didn't need to say things that were already obvious. The street had people on it, and some of them were watching. They had seen Harlan Peck come out of the bank with his lawyer, and the look on his face, and that look, was the kind that traveled fast in a small town, the kind that told you without words that something had happened inside that hadn't gone the way it was planned. Margaret walked beside Colton to the wagon, and he helped her up and climbed up himself and clicked the horses into motion, and they were out of town and starting back up the mountain road before either of them spoke. "Where did you learn about property petition procedures?" he said. "My father's business had a creditor problem the year before he died," she said. "I read every document I could find. Talked to the solicitor's clerk for 3 hours one afternoon." She looked at the road ahead. He was surprised a girl was interested. "I didn't explain that the girl was the one who'd been keeping the accounts for 2 years. Colton was quiet for a moment. "What else don't I know about you?" he said. And it wasn't weighted or dramatic. It was asked with a genuine wondering quality, the way you ask about a country you've been traveling in and keep finding new terrain. She thought about it seriously. "I speak passable French. I can identify 17 varieties of wildflower by their leaves alone. I once argued a freight company down from a disputed bill by finding an error in their weight calculations that their own clerk had missed." She paused. "I'm a very poor dancer. I can't carry a tune to save my life, and I'm afraid of bats, which I know is irrational." He was quiet for long enough that she turned to look at him. The corner of his mouth was doing the thing, both corners this time. It was not yet a smile, but it was the closest she had seen, and it transformed his face in a way that made her realize with a start how much younger he was under the weathering. How much of what she had read as age was actually accumulated gravity, and what he would look like if he let some of the gravity go. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. But the corners didn't go back. "Colton Hayes, if you are laughing at me." "I'm not laughing," he said. He was absolutely laughing silently internally in the particular way of a man who had forgotten he knew how to, and was startled to find himself doing it. "Bats. They are unpredictable," she said with dignity. "And fast." "They are," he agreed gravely, and the gravity itself was part of it. The controlled gravity of a man holding something in, and she watched his face do it and felt something warm and enormous move through her chest. Because a man holding in laughter was a man alive in a way he hadn't been before. And she had done that. She had found that in him, and it was the best thing she had found yet. They made it back to the ranch in the early afternoon, and the work waiting was significant. The barn roof still needed completing. There were fence lines to check the animals to see to after the storm disruption, and they separated into it, without discussion, each taking what was theirs to take. But something had changed in the quality of the separating. The way he looked at her before he went to the barn. The way she found herself listening for his voice in the yard. Billy noticed. Billy noticed everything, which was a thing about Billy she had come to appreciate and occasionally find inconvenient. He came to the kitchen door at mid-afternoon on the pretext of wanting coffee. He always had a pretext, and stood with his cup and said with studied casualness, "You two did something in town today." "We had a meeting," Margaret said. "Word came up the mountain ahead of you," he said. Thomas rode in from the Lundgren place and told Chet that Harlan Peck came out of the bank looking like he'd bitten into something that bit back. She said nothing and kept her hands in the bread she was working. "Been a long time," Billy said, "since this place had somebody in it who could do that." He wasn't talking about the bank anymore. She understood that. Since this place had somebody in it, period, who really... He stopped. "You know what I mean, ma'am." "I know what you mean." she said. Good, he said. Just wanted to... He stopped again. He's a good man. He just forgot how for a while. She looked up from the bread. He didn't forget, she said. He just needed someone who wasn't going to walk away while he remembered. Billy nodded. He finished his coffee. He went back out. She heard him say something to Chet in the yard that she couldn't make out, and she heard Chet's grunt, which was his version of a complete sentence. And then she heard nothing except the normal sounds of the ranch going about its afternoon. She was pulling bread from the oven when Colton came in. He washed his hands. He sat at the table. He looked at the bread, and then at her, and she set a piece in front of him with butter, and he ate it the way he ate things she made completely, without wasting it, with the attention of a man to whom the fact of being fed well was not ordinary, and had not been ordinary for a long time. The roof's finished, he said. Good. East fence line held. Better than I expected. Also good. He was quiet. Margaret. He said her name the way he'd started saying it recently, not to get her attention. She was already looking at him, but as something in itself. Like the name was a sentence. Yes, she said. He looked at his hands. Looked at her. Looked at his hands. She recognized this. The formation of a sentence that mattered, the careful gathering of exactly the right words, the refusal to say less than he meant, or more than he was sure of. I want to talk to Reverend Mills, he said. About... He stopped. I want to make this. I want to do this properly. If you want... She watched him. Are you asking me to marry you? She said. She kept her voice even. Perfectly, completely even. He looked at her. I'm saying I want to ask Reverend Mills about the process, he said. I thought you should know before I did, in case you... He stopped. In case you'd rather I didn't. She looked at him across the table. In the kitchen she had made warm, in the house she was making into a home on the mountain, she had decided was worth the work of understanding. Colton, she said. Yes. You have been the most difficult person to get a straight answer from that I have encountered in 28 years of life. He looked at her steadily. I know. Ask me directly. A very long pause. Will you marry me, Margaret Ellis? He said. Properly. In the church. With Vera there and Billy and Chet and Thomas. He looked at her with that bedrock certainty. Will you stay? On this mountain. In this house. With me. She looked at him. She thought about the stagecoach and the letters and the first supper and the yellow curtain and the seeds and the bank and his hand on hers in the kitchen, the grip of a man deciding not to let go. Yes, she said. I will. He breathed. It was a very quiet breath, the kind that contains a great deal that has been held for a long time. Good, he said. Good, she agreed. Then Thomas put his head in the kitchen door and said with tremendous urgency that one of the mares was behaving strangely, and he thought she might be foaling early from the storm. Stress, and Colton was on his feet immediately, and Margaret was right behind him, and they went out together into the cold afternoon to deal with what the mountain needed them to deal with next, because that was the work, that was always the work, and neither of them minded. The foal came just before dark. It was small and dark and determined, and it was on its feet within the hour. And Thomas watched it with an expression of such complete and unconcealed wonder that Margaret found her eyes stinging in a way she didn't try to explain. Colton crouched beside the mare with his hand on her neck, talking to her quietly, and the lamplight in the barn was warm, and outside the mountain was settling back into itself after the violence of the storm. Billy said the foal needed a name. Colton looked up at Margaret across the barn. She looked back at him. She thought about seeds in window boxes and a photograph standing upright in morning light. She thought about everything that had been brought back to life in this place slowly, without anyone making a speech about it. Clara, she said. The barn was very quiet. Colton looked at her for a long time with an expression that was not one thing, but everything at once, every wall, down every careful management of feeling set aside, and she let him look, and she did not look away, and she did not need him to say anything because he wasn't able to say anything, and that was exactly right. "Clara," he said finally. "Just the name. Just that." Billy nodded. Chet nodded. Thomas looked between the adults, with the perception of a boy old enough to understand that something large had just happened, even if he couldn't have said what. Margaret went to Colton's side and stood beside him and put her hand over his hand on the mare's neck. And he turned his hand over and took hers, and they stood like that in the warm barn with the new foal and the man who had forgotten how to live, and the woman who had refused to leave, and outside the storm was over, and the mountain was quiet, and the long, hard, beautiful work of it was just beginning. The next morning she came downstairs to find Colton at the kitchen table with the ledger and a piece of paper and a pen, working through the herd rebuild plan in his careful, precise handwriting. He had made coffee. There was a cup already poured for her sitting at her place, exactly the temperature it would be if he'd timed it to when he expected her to come down. She stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the cup of coffee and the man who had made it, and the morning light coming through the yellow curtain, and she thought about Ohio and the envelope she'd mailed, and the 4-word letters, and the 6 women who had come before her, and a photograph face down in a book. She sat down and picked up her cup and said, "Show me where you are in the plan." "No." He turned the ledger toward her, and she leaned in beside him, and they put their heads together over the numbers in the morning light, and that was how Vera found them 40 minutes later when she came up the mountain unannounced, because that was simply the kind of woman Vera Whitmore was. She stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at them, heads bent together, talking low, Margaret's hand on the ledger and Colton's pen moving, and she said nothing for a moment. Just looked. Then she said, "I'll put the kettle on," and walked past them to the stove. And the way she moved through that kitchen easily without asking, like a woman in a place she belonged, told Margaret that Vera had been waiting a long time for a morning like this. That she had been standing outside this particular warmth for 5 years, and had almost stopped believing it would ever be there again. "Vera," Margaret said. Thank you. For yesterday. For delaying Clemens until we got there." Vera put the kettle on and turned around and looked at her with those sharp eyes that were underneath all the sharpness, simply the eyes of a woman who had loved someone very much and lost her. "Don't thank me," she said. "Clara would have done the same thing for you." She paused. "She would have liked you enormously. Bossy, practical women who read legal documents and aren't afraid of anyone that was her favorite kind of person." "It took one to know one," Margaret said. Vera looked at her for 3 seconds. She smiled. It was her full smile, not the almost smile Margaret had seen before, and it changed her face completely. "Yes," she said. "It did." Colton was watching them both. He looked at Vera. He looked at Margaret. He looked back at the ledger with the expression of a man who is feeling something too large for the kitchen, but is choosing to let it live there anyway. "The rebuild plan," he said to the ledger. "We need 10 more head minimum to make the numbers work." "I know someone in Billings," Vera said, putting out cups. "He owes me a reasonable price." "Of course he does," Colton said. "I know a lot of people who owe me reasonable prices," she said serenely. "It's one of the advantages of being old and paying attention." Margaret laughed. Colton made the sound she had decided was his laugh, not a full laugh, not yet, but real honest, the breath of a man who had found something funny and was allowing himself to know it. Vera poured the tea and sat down at the table with them, and the morning went on around the 3 of them, practical and warm, and full of the kind of ordinary talk that is not ordinary at all when it is happening in a place that was silent and cold and closed for far too long. Outside in the window boxes, the blooms the storm had flattened were already lifting. She noticed that before any of them. She always noticed first. That was the thing about Margaret Ellis. Margaret Hayes, the thing no one had seen coming when she stepped off that stagecoach in the mud with fury in her eyes and a suitcase in her hand. She noticed what other people had stopped looking for. She saw what was still alive in the places everyone else had given up on. That had always been her gift, and she had finally found the place where it was needed most. Reverend Mills was a small man with large hands and the patient expression of someone who had heard everything twice and was still willing to listen to it a third time. He received Colton in his study on a Wednesday morning, and he received the news that Colton Hayes intended to marry his mail-order bride properly in the church, with witnesses with the particular stillness of a man who had been praying for exactly this, and was not going to say so out loud because some prayers are answered so precisely that naming them feels like tempting something. "When?" he asked. "Spring," Colton said. "When the road is clear and Vera can get up the mountain without it being a mission." Mills nodded. He looked at Colton with those patient eyes. "She's good for you," he said, not a question. Colton held his gaze. "Yes," he said. "She is." "Then we'll make it right," Mills said. "In the spring." What happened between Wednesday and spring was not a straight line. Nothing on that mountain ever was. The first thing that happened was the letter. It arrived 2 weeks after the bank meeting, addressed to Margaret in a hand she recognized before she even turned it over, her sister Ruth's handwriting, the particular forward lean of it, that had always looked like it was in a hurry to get somewhere. She sat at the kitchen table and opened it while Colton was in the yard, and she read it twice, and then she set it on the table in front of her, and looked at it the way you look at something that requires a response you're not entirely ready to give. Ruth was worried. Ruth had been worried since the stagecoach. But this letter was different from the others. It was not asking Margaret to reconsider. It was not cataloging the risks of mountain life, or the unknowability of men you'd never met. It was asking her to come home. Their mother had been unwell. "Nothing dangerous," Ruth said, and then used enough qualifications around "nothing dangerous" that Margaret understood it was more than nothing. Their mother was in her 70s. The house needed things done that Ruth couldn't manage alone. She was still sitting with the letter when Colton came in. He saw her face before he saw the letter. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down and said nothing, which was the right thing, and waited. She told him. He listened with his whole body, the particular quality of attention he gave to things that mattered, and when she was done, he said, "How long would you need?" She looked at him. "To go," he said. "See your mother. See your sister. How long would you need?" "Colton, it's a question," he said. "Not a—" He paused. "I'm not asking you to stay. I'm asking how long." She looked at him across the table and understood something that she had been understanding slowly across months, one piece at a time, that this man who had built his entire life around the premise that people left who had been abandoned, young and widowed, and left again by 6 women in sequence, was sitting across from her right now and asking how long she would be gone, not whether she was coming back. The question itself was the thing. The assumption underneath the question. 3 weeks, she said. Maybe 4. He nodded. "I'll arrange the stage." "You don't have to." "I know I don't," he said. "I want to." She folded Ruth's letter. She looked at him. "I'm coming back," she said. "I know," he said. And he said it the way he said things he was completely certain of, no hedging, no qualification. Like a man who had done the work of deciding to believe something and was not going to undecide it. She left on a Friday. All of them came to see her off, Billy with his hat in his hands, Chet with his grunt nod that she had learned to translate as considerable warmth, Thomas standing very straight in the way of young men who are trying to look like they are not feeling things they are clearly feeling. Vera had come down from wherever Vera materialized from and stood at the edge of the yard with her arms folded. Colton put her trunk on the wagon. He helped her up. He stood at the wagon wheel and looked up at her, and she looked down at him, and the morning was cold and clear, and the window boxes were bare now waiting for spring, and the foal Clara was in the barn learning how to be herself. "I'll write," she said. "I'll read them," he said. She almost said something larger. She could feel it, the larger thing, the words that were available if she reached for them. She saw in his face that he could feel it too. But they were in the yard with Billy and Chet and Thomas and Vera, all carefully not watching them, which is its own form of watching, and this was not the moment for the larger thing. "Take care of your side," she said. "It's healed." "Take care of it anyway." The corner of his mouth. "Yes, ma'am," he said. She laughed. He stepped back. The wagon moved, and she rode down the switchback road, and at the first bend she turned and looked back, and he was still standing in the yard, not moving, watching her go, and she held that image of him, the height and the stillness and the certainty in his posture, a man who had decided to stand still and wait instead of turning away, and she carried it all the way to Ohio. Ohio was smaller than she remembered, not the geography of it that was the same flat and familiar and green in a way that Montana was not green, but the interior dimensions of it, the social geography, the way people moved through the spaces they'd always moved through. She had been gone less than 6 months, and she had become a slightly different person in a way that Ohio had no category for, and she felt that the whole time she was there, not uncomfortably, but definitely. Her mother was more unwell than Ruth had said in the letter, and Margaret was glad she had come because the situation required exactly the kind of clear-eyed management that Margaret was, now she realized, very practiced at. She organized the doctor's visits. She reorganized the house for practical movement. She sat with her mother in the evenings and told her about the mountain and the ranch and Colton, and her mother listened with her eyes closed and the small smile of a woman who has spent a lifetime worrying about her daughter and is feeling the worry lift. "Is he good?" her mother asked one evening. "At the bottom of everything. Is he good?" Margaret didn't hesitate. "At the bottom of everything," she said, "he is the best man I've ever known." Her mother was quiet for a moment. "Then you go back," she said. "I'll be all right." She wrote to Colton 3 times in 4 weeks. The letters were not romantic. They were her, which meant they were direct and detailed and occasionally funny and said exactly what she meant. She told him about her mother. She told him about Ohio's flatness and how she had not expected to miss the mountain, but did a specific missing the way you miss something that has become part of how you breathe. She told him she was coming back on the 14th if the stage was running and asked him not to make a fuss about it. His letters came back in his hand, the careful, precise one, and they were short, the way his sentences were short, but she had learned by now that his brevity was not absence. The first letter said the foal was growing well, and Billy had repaired the east fence line, and they had heard back from Vera's man in Billings about the cattle price. The second letter said Harding had received Harlan Peck's formal written notice, and the 30-day clock was running, and he thought they were in a strong position. The third letter said, "The kitchen doesn't feel right with no one in it. The yellow curtain is still there. Come back when you can." She read that letter 4 times. She read it the way she had read his first 4-word agency letters, except this time the 4 words at the end, "come back when you can," contained everything. His first letters had deliberately withheld, and the distance between those 2 versions of him was the distance she had traveled and helped him travel, and she felt it in her chest, like the first measure of a song that resolves into something beautiful. She came back on the 14th. He was at the stage stop when she arrived, not waiting in the wagon, which would have been the practical arrangement. Standing with the wagon behind him, in the same spot on the same street where she had dropped his letters in his chest 6 months ago, and told him to treat her like a human being. He was not doing the careful blankness. His face was doing something it had not done on that first day, something that on another man she would have called being unable to hide what he felt. She stepped down from the stage, and he was there. He took her suitcase. He didn't reach for her trunk. He had someone else for that, and his free hand found hers, the way it had in the kitchen, with the certainty of a man who had decided this was where his hand went. And he said, "Good trip." "Long trip," she said. "You look—" He stopped. "What?" He looked at her. "Like you're back," he said. "You look like you're back." She squeezed his hand. "I am back," she said. "Take me home." And he did. The winter settled in after that with a completeness that made the storm seem in retrospect like a rehearsal. But they were ready for it. The barn roof solid, the wood boxes full. The food stores carefully managed the herd, slightly larger than it had been, thanks to Vera's man in Billings, and a price that was, as Vera had promised, reasonable. The ranch entered the cold months the way a well-made thing enters difficulty, not untouched by it, but built to hold. The second major twist came in January, and it did not come from Harlan Peck. It came from Colton's father. She had not known his father was alive. He had not said his father was alive. He had talked about his father in the past-weighted way that people talk about difficult presences from their history. Not the present-weighted way of someone with a living relationship, and she had absorbed the impression of a man long gone without ever directly forming the thought. His father was not long gone. Emmett Hayes arrived at the ranch on a January morning with the particular air of a man who believed his arrival required no announcement. A big man gone heavy with age, with Colton's height and none of his stillness, with eyes that moved around the yard, taking inventory in a way that made Margaret's shoulders tighten before she knew why. She was on the porch when he rode in. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and she understood immediately and completely who he was, the way you understand things that have been explained to you in advance, even when the explanation was indirect. "You'd be the new wife," he said from horseback without preamble. "I'm Margaret," she said. "You'd be Emmett." He looked at her. He took in everything. Her size, her bearing, the way she was standing on that porch, like she was planted in it, and his expression moved through several things before settling on an assessment she couldn't entirely read. "Colton around," he said. "He is," she said. "I'll get him." She went inside and found Colton in the study and said simply and quietly, "Your father is in the yard." He went absolutely still. She watched his face. She watched the years move across it in about 4 seconds. 11 years old, a woman leaving from a porch, a man with no expression watching her go, and everything that had grown in the soil of that watching. She watched all of it, and then she watched him put it somewhere and stand up. "You don't have to come out," he said. "Yes, I do," she said. "But I'll follow your lead." He looked at her, and the look said several things, the chief of which was gratitude, in the particular form it took when someone offers to stand with you instead of behind you. They went out together. What followed in the yard was not the confrontation she had half expected. Emmett Hayes was not a demonstrative man, the evidence for where Colton had learned that was immediate and unmistakable, but he was not. She realized, as the morning went on, precisely the villain of the story either. He was a man who had made bad choices a long time ago out of his own hurt, who had passed those choices down in the way that parents pass things down, whether they mean to or not, who had spent years not coming, because coming required acknowledging what he'd left his son with. He'd heard about the bank situation. That was why he'd come, or that was the pretext, and Colton received that with the same flat face he gave most things, while she watched the muscle in his jaw work the way it worked when he was managing something large and quiet. They sat at her kitchen table, the three of them, and she made coffee, and she put bread out, and she watched the two men negotiate the geography of a relationship that had been set badly decades ago and was not going to be repaired in a morning. She didn't try to smooth it. She didn't perform warmth to fill the silences. She sat in her chair in her kitchen and let it be what it was, which was two men trying to find the first honest sentence they'd said to each other in 30 years. Emmett found it first, which surprised her. He picked up his coffee and looked at it and said to the cup more than to Colton, "I heard you took out that loan the year after Clara died. I should have come then." He paused. "I didn't come." The kitchen was very quiet. "No," Colton said. "You didn't." "I'm coming now," Emmett said. He looked up. "It's late. I know it's late." Colton looked at his father with an expression she had learned over months of careful attention, and that she understood in a way she suspected very few people in his life had ever understood. He was deciding. Not whether to forgive, that was a longer process, and not one that happened at kitchen tables over a single morning, but whether to leave the door open enough for the process to begin. She saw the decision happen. "You can stay in the bunkhouse," Colton said. "Until the road is clear." Emmett nodded once. He looked at Margaret. "You run a good kitchen," he said. "Thank you," she said. "Got a lot of light in here," he said, looking at the yellow curtain. Colton's mother would have liked that curtain. The table was very still. Colton looked at the curtain. He looked at his father. He looked at his coffee. Her name was Margaret too, Emmett said. His mother, Margaret Ann. He said it like a man putting down something heavy he's carried for a long time and isn't entirely sure what to do with his hands now that it's down. I never said her name after she left. Thought it was easier. He paused. It wasn't easier. She watched Colton receive that. She watched him sit with it. The information that the woman who had left had shared her name, that some thread connected them across time, in a way that nobody had planned. And she thought about seeds that grow in soil that has been worked by other hands, about the photograph that had been face down for 5 years, and was now standing in morning light about the chair on the porch being reclaimed one Sunday at a time. I know, Colton said finally to his father, to the coffee, to the yellow curtain. It wasn't easier. Emmett stayed 2 weeks. It was not uncomplicated. There were mornings where the two men moved around each other in the yard, with a careful distance that spoke to everything still unresolved between them, and there were evenings where she heard them talking in the barn, in the low voice Colton used for things that mattered, and she left those conversations alone because they were not hers. She fed Emmett, and she was honest with him, and she did not pretend things were simpler than they were. And she noticed that he responded to that, to the not pretending, in the same way Colton had responded to it from the very beginning. Like it was the specific thing he'd been needing, without knowing he'd needed it. The morning he left, he stopped at the porch steps. He looked at her. He looked at Colton standing beside her. "You found a good one," he said to his son, gruffly, the way he probably said everything that cost him something. Colton's hand found the small of her back. "I know," he said. Emmett nodded. He mounted his horse. He looked at Margaret one more time. "You going to be all right on this mountain?" he said. Like the 6 months she'd already been here were still a question. She looked at him with the look she had first used on the street in Pine Creek, the look she had used on Harlan Peck and on Clemens and on every person who had looked at her and decided too quickly what they were seeing. "Mr. Hayes," she said, "I am better than all right." He almost smiled. It was a Hayes almost smile, the same corner, the same controlled quality of a man who has forgotten smiling is available and is startled to find it. He rode away down the mountain, and Colton stood beside her, and she could feel the complexity of what he was feeling without needing to name it. "You okay?" she asked. "No," he said, "but I will be." She put her hand on his arm. He covered it with his. They stood on the porch in the cold January morning and let the road settle back to quiet. Spring arrived, the way spring arrives on a mountain, not gently, not all at once, but in arguments, warm days, and then cold days, and then a week of rain that turned the lower road to mud and made everyone on the ranch impatient in the particular way of people who have been inside a long winter and can smell the end of it. The flowers in the window boxes came back. Margaret had not replanted them. They came back on their own, the roots having survived under the snow in a way that she found disproportionately moving and that she thought Colton felt too, though he only said, looking at the first green thread appearing tougher than they look. "That's what people said about me," she said. "I know," he said. "I was paying attention." The wedding was on a Saturday in April, exactly as Colton had said when the road was clear, and Vera could get up the mountain without it being a mission. It was not a grand wedding. She had not wanted a grand wedding. She had wanted the specific thing she got, which was Reverend Mills in the small church in Pine Creek, with the people who had witnessed the thing actually being built, Billy with his good shirt on, and a look of enormous satisfaction on his face. Chet in the back row with his arms folded and an expression that was his version of beaming Thomas, standing so straight he looked a full inch taller and probably believed he was. Vera in the front pew in a dark green dress, sitting with her hands folded and her sharp face doing something it rarely did, which was simply being openly glad. Emmett Hayes was there. He had come back down from wherever he wintered, had arrived 2 days before, without announcement, in the way that had apparently been his habit his entire life, and he sat beside Vera in the front pew. which was a pairing that Margaret suspected would terrify any reasonable man, but that Vera handled with her characteristic composure, and that Emmett handled by choosing not to speak, which was probably the safest option available to him. Harding from the bank had come. She had not expected that. He stood in the back and nodded to her when she arrived, and the nod said things about the bank meeting and the 30-day response and the restructuring terms that had been formally agreed 2 months ago. All the things that had made the financial ground solid under what they were building, and she nodded back, and that was enough. Harlan Peck was not there. She had not expected him to be. She stood at the back of the church in the dress Vera had helped her alter, a good dress, not white, a deep blue, the color of the mountain sky at midday, and she breathed through the complicated feeling of standing on the edge of a choice that had already been made. The ceremony being not the beginning of the thing, but the naming of it, the public saying of what had been true for months. Billy walked her up the aisle because she had asked him to, and he had gone red to his ears and agreed immediately. She held his arm, and she walked toward the front of the church, and Colton turned from where he was standing with Reverend Mills, and he looked at her, and his face did the thing it had been slowly learning to do across the months, the thing that was not quite open, but was no longer closed, the thing that was him in the full complexity of who he was, the grief and the stubbornness, and the man who left candy on kitchen tables and named a foal. Clara, and wrote the kitchen doesn't feel right, with no one in it. In a letter, because it was the truest sentence he could find. She reached him. Billy stepped back. "You look," Colton started. "Like I'm here," she said. "Yes," he said. "Exactly like that." Mills said the words, and they said the words back to him, and she felt the room around her, felt the particular weight of the witnesses they had gathered. Every person in that church had been part of the making of this, had seen some piece of what it had taken, and had not looked away from it. And when it came to the part where Mills paused and looked at Colton and said, "Do you have anything you want to say?" Because Mills was the kind of minister who believed the ceremony should have room for the truth. The official words didn't always catch. Colton turned to her, and he held her gaze in the direct way that had always been the most honest thing about him, and he said, "I spent 5 years believing that the mountain was why people left, that I was too hard, the life was too hard, and that was just the way it was going to be." He paused, the way he always paused to find exactly what he meant. "You came up that road, and you didn't leave. And you made me understand that the mountain was never the problem." He was quiet. "You stayed when you didn't have to. That's the bravest thing I've ever seen anyone do. And I'm going to spend however long I've got making sure you never regret it." She felt Vera shift in the front pew. She did not look because she needed to hold his gaze, and she was not entirely sure what her face was doing, and she did not want the people in the pews to see whatever it was before she had a moment with it herself. "Don't make promises you can't keep, Colton Hayes," she said. "I don't make promises I can't keep," he said. "You know that." "I do," she said. "I know that." She breathed. She let herself say the larger thing that had been available for months, that she had been waiting for the right moment for, and this was the right moment in this room with these people with him. "I came 2,000 miles because I was done waiting for a life that wasn't coming to me, and I found out that the life I wanted wasn't in Ohio. It was on a mountain in Montana with the most difficult, most honest, most decent man I've ever known." She held his gaze. "That's where it was. Right here." Mills said, "Amen." The room said, "Amen." Billy said something indistinct that was probably amen, but might have been something else given the sound of his voice. Colton kissed her in the plain, certain way he did things like a man who has decided something and is not second-guessing it. And Vera stood up in the front pew, and Thomas cheered, and Chet made the sound that was his version of a cheer, and the church was full of it. Full of all the things that had been building across the months, and the winter, and the storm, and the bank meeting, and the photograph, and the seeds, and every supper, and every morning on that mountain. The celebration afterward was at the ranch. She stood on the porch in the spring afternoon with the window boxes blooming orange and yellow and white, and she looked out at the yard full of people she had come to know. One hard-won day at a time, and she felt the mountain around her, the way she had felt it from the beginning. Enormous, real, uncompromising. Except that now, she felt herself in it differently. Not a visitor, not a woman enduring conditions. A person who belonged to a place, and to whom the place belonged in return. Colton came to stand beside her. He had a glass in each hand, and he gave her one, and they stood at the porch rail and looked at their yard. "Vera is telling Emmett something he doesn't agree with," he said. She looked. Vera had Emmett cornered near the barn with her arms folded and her chin up. Emmett looked like a man who has found himself in a situation he has no tools for. "She'll win," Margaret said. "She always does," Colton said. He looked at her. "Are you happy?" The question surprised her. Not the content of it, but the asking of it. This man who had spent 5 years not asking anyone how they felt about anything, asking her directly standing at his own porch rail on his own wedding day, needing to know. She looked at the yard. The flowers. The foal Clara visible through the barn door, dark and sure on her feet now. Billy laughing at something Thomas had said. The mountain above, everything present and permanent, and exactly as demanding as it had always been. "Yes," she said. She looked at him. "Are you?" He looked at her in the way she had catalogued across months. The careful look that was not blankness, but depth, not absence, but the presence of a man who meant what he showed, even when what he showed was small. Then he looked at the yard, at the people in it, at the flowers and the foal, and all the evidence of what one woman's refusal to leave had rebuilt in a place everyone had agreed was too far gone. "Yes," he said. And the word in his mouth had the quality of a man saying something true that he had not been sure he would ever be able to say again. Thomas wandered onto the porch and helped himself to bread from the plate she'd left there, and stood next to them, looking out at the yard with the comfortable ease of a boy who had found his place in a household and knew it, and for a while the three of them just stood there and let the afternoon be what it was. Later, much later, after the guests had gone and the yard was quiet, and the spring dark had come down over the mountain. She sat on the porch in what was now definitively her chair, and the mountain was silent. The way it got on clear nights, a silence so complete you could hear your own heartbeat in it. And Colton sat beside her in his chair, and they had their coffee, and said nothing for a long while. Then Colton said, "I want to add a room, on the south side." She looked at him. He was looking at the mountain. "A bigger kitchen," she said. "No," he said. "Different." He paused. "For in case. If there are—" He stopped. He was coloring slightly in the way he did when he had to say something that cost him the careful control he kept on things. She understood him before he finished. She looked back at the mountain. She let the silence be what it was for a long moment, and she felt everything. It contained the foal in the barn, and the seeds in the boxes, and a photograph standing upright in morning light, and a man who had decided to believe in the future again. "All right," she said. "South side gets good light." He exhaled. She heard it. He picked up his coffee. "Good," he said. "Good," she said. Above them, the mountain stars were extraordinary, in the way that mountain stars always were indifferent to human decisions and vast beyond any measure. And below them the ranch was quiet and warm, and full of the life that one stubborn, clear-eyed woman had refused to let go dark. She had come here with one trunk and one hat box and a piece of yellow fabric, and the absolute conviction that her worth was not measured by what the world had told her she was worth. She had been right about that. She had been right about the man. She had been right about the mountain. And in the morning she would get up before dawn and make coffee that would be exactly the right temperature when he came downstairs, and he would sit across from her, and they would plan the south room, and check the herd numbers, and write to Vera about something practical, and the day would be ordinary, in all the ways that days become ordinary when they are built on something real. This was not the life she had waited for in Ohio. It was better than that. It was the life she had chosen and fought for, and stayed for, and built with her own hands, in a place everyone said was too cold and too hard and too far away for a woman like her. And it was hers completely, and without apology, the way all things belong to the people who refused to let them go. She had not lasted a week. She had lasted a lifetime. And that made all the difference.